Hi, today we'll learn about studying the past. Go ahead, go to our website lodausd.net and go to Clever. And from Clever, you log in to Cengage and go ahead, enter your student account. On the left side, you'll see Chapter 1, The Roman Empire and Christianity, pages 10 to 39. Go ahead, open it and proceed to Section 1. And under Section 1, you will see the first lesson is studying the past, pages 12 to 13. You should see this in your screen right now, and every lesson in this book is arranged in this format. Historians are like detectives. They ask questions about the past and begin with who, what, where, when, why, and how. Then they search for and examine evidence, seeking answers to their questions. As you study the past here in this class, you'll become like a detective. You'll learn to think like a historian and use the same skills. You'll develop a historian's mindset. Historians ask questions that are rooted in a particular time and place. Well, the most basic information that historians must establish is when and where a person lived or an event occurred. But this should not limit us into thinking that history is just about memorizing places and dates. If that's the case, then it becomes boring and monotonous, and it will not be that significant in the whole perspective of the things that we do in this class and the society as a whole. Now, because time and place are so basic to the study of history, timelines and maps are crucial tools to historians. If you remember, we had a lesson about timeline and chronology, why it's important to understand the order of things and series of events and how and when they happened. Maps show physical and cultural features of neighborhoods, cities, states, and countries. They can explain how such events as historical migration of a group of people and growth of an empire or an economic system happened and spread across various places. If you skim through this book, you will find timelines and maps that show this kind of information. Researching and evaluating evidence. Now, these two things are very important, and I want you to pay attention. In history, we always talk about two sources. These are the primary and the secondary sources. As you can tell, when you say primary, it is more important than the other one, the secondary sources. Now let's talk about their distinctions and what makes a primary source different to a secondary source and what makes these two sources collaborate together to come up with an information that is as close as possible to the facts. Primary source documents are writings or recordings that were created by someone who witnessed or lived through a historical event. For example, diaries and autobiographies and journals. Probably you can still remember the diary of Anne Frank. Or ancient manuscripts that were discovered in Greece or Egypt. We also have oral histories. So these are the stories that people tell, but they did not write or record those interviews. Say, for example, the story that your grandparents tell you about their experience growing up in the neighborhood. So oral history can be considered as primary sources. Now let's go to the secondary sources. These are writings, recordings, and objects created after an event by someone who did not see or live during the time when it occurred. Secondary sources are based on primary source. History books and many biographies are secondary sources. Obviously, the textbook or book that we are using, the online book that we are using in history is considered to be a secondary source. It may be considered a secondary source, but it is full of primary sources such as pictures, maps, manuscripts, and artifacts, pictures of these things. And obviously, the pictures are not considered primary source, but in a way, we can say that these are the actual pictures of the primary source that this secondary source, this world history book, was based from. Bottom line, primary sources are the originals and secondary sources are the interpretations. So primary and secondary sources are important in order to make an understanding or come up with an understanding with what happened in the past. For example, a piece of pottery or an artifact will not make sense to you, although it's a primary source, until somebody explains its significance or historical significance and meaning. All historians examine primary and secondary sources. They apply reasoning skills to evaluate information. For example, to evaluate a piece of writing, a historian asks these questions. Is the author stating the fact or an opinion? Is this information relevant? That is, does it apply to the issues being studied? Is this information essential or important? Can the information be verified or proven by another reliable source? What is the context or setting of this information? What is the author's point of view? For example, the picture that you are seeing on your screen is a man who was frozen in time when Mount Vesuvius erupted around 79 AD. So this is a primary source document, but obviously it is in a secondary source book. Trivia: August 24th is the day when Mount Vesuvius erupted. Check your date. Now, interpreting evidence. After historians examine and evaluate evidence, they try to put together a whole picture or story. That is, combining primary and secondary sources. Historians do not tell the same story. Different historians may interpret different evidence in different ways. Now, why? A historian may accidentally overlook certain evidence or make an error in interpreting an evidence. In addition, new evidence is continually being discovered. That means the interpretation of history differ and often change. Now, this piece of information is very important because this is the answer to the review and assess or check for understanding question that I will post in our Google Classroom. Why do interpretations of history differ and often change? Like what I told you, different historians may interpret the same evidence in different ways. They might overlook some things because of their bias or accidentally if they are not paying attention to details. And another thing, additional information are being discovered as we go on in time. For one last time, let me repeat the question. Why do interpretations of history differ and often change? Well, it's because of the historians. Historians may accidentally overlook some facts or information, maybe because by accident, and sometimes it's because of their bias. They just want to emphasize certain information. And of course, the reality of there are new evidence that are being discovered as we move on in time, especially as we advance in technology and different resources that we use to understand the past. Now go to our Google Classroom and answer the review and assess question that I posted there.